I think the most important thing for me tonight that was this George's comments about the bus. That's how I got hooked in. I was in Palo Alto. I had just split up with my boyfriend. I hitched a ride with these two crazy dudes, one of whom turned out to be Neil Cassidy, and wound up at 4:30 in the morning pulling over the bridge into Ken's place in La Honda. And I'd heard about these people. Their rumor about Kesey and the pranksters had circulated around Palo Alto during my short stay there. And I had wished that I could meet these people that were so unique and unusual. And suddenly there I was. And it was dark, and just the first little rays of dawn were breaking through the trees. These huge redwood trees with the giant sword ferns all around them. The sound of the creek rushing by, pre-dawn chill. And I came around the corner and got out of the car. There's the bus looming up out of the redwoods in the gloom and the dark. Here's this enormous, bulbous, funny-looking, the big bug-eye headlights, and it has the things on the engine, that fold up, actual bonnet wings, and painted to death. And I hadn't any idea that this thing even existed, and I kind of crawled up on the bumper. I could see that there was a sign. There was a sign on the front of the thing, and in the total darkness, I reached up there and realized that it said further. And I just cracked up. I thought that was the silliest thing I'd ever seen in my life. So that did it. I had to walk all the way around the bus and look at every single thing. And right over the door, which was the usual bus door. I was a bus monitor as a child, so I know buses. So here's the school bus door, and it says on it in little wiggly letters, painted on and painted over several times and painted back on. Nothing lasts. And I just stopped, and I said, nothing lasts. And I thought about that for a long time. And as I walked around the bus and I looked at all the rest of the things and the strange slogans, it said, weird load on the back bumper. And I was exclaiming and making a little bit too much noise. And Neil says, shh, be quiet. You'll wake up the dogs. And then music started. There was music coming out of the trees. And there was jazz. And we sort of stopped as we were trying to be quiet. And out walks Ken from his studio in the back of the property. And he comes walking up saying, what are you guys doing here? What do you want? And we said, oh, we're just bringing your car back, says Neil. He's been driving it for the last 12 hours straight. But I need to borrow it again, says Neil, because I've got to go to work. But I just thought you might want to see it for a few minutes. And I said, are you still up? I said to Ken. He says, and he said, yes. And we went back he says, come on back to the studio. And there was a little house back there perched by the creek behind these enormous redwood trees. And he told us the legend about this little house, that it was the hideout of the Younger Gang at some point in distant California history during the gold rush days. And it was just this little funky shack, but this was his writing shack. And in there he had one of those old heaters, that has concentric rings of heat, and it sort of glows, and it's like a big eye. And that thing was glowing and heating, and he had been sitting at his desk cleaning out the drawers. And so we were allowed to sit there with him and get warm in the chilly dawn and watch as Ken went through the drawers of this desk, that he had left all these little bits of writing in the drawers of his desk. And I'm being very quiet, and I'm watching this because I realize that I'm in the presence of, a famous writer. And so I was really excited by this. And he reaches in the desk drawer and he pulls out a handful of these little shreds of paper and throws them down. He says, God damn it, the mice have been in here. So So we start to try to piece some of this back together. And it's got little mice tooth marks all around it, but there's phrases. And what he did was when he edited, he would edit with scissors, and he would just take scissors and cut up between the lines and cut out pieces that didn't fit, and then tape it all back together again and rejuggle it, and this little, so the manuscripts themselves were just this taped together sort of little quilted nightmare. But there was all these pieces left over, and that's what was in there. And on each little piece of paper was some amazing turn of phrase that he'd come up with that he just couldn't part with. But the mice had rearranged everything. So none of it made any sense. And it just was a moment of seeing how his mind works, seeing that if you take turns of phrase, if you take little patchworks of energy and of thought and tape them together, and you make long thoughts, and the chain would get longer and longer, and the thoughts would go astray, sort of like that poetry that you stick on your refrigerator. And it just wandered off, and he was taping these things onto the desk, and they were dribbling down onto the floor until he had long, rambling sentences that went in circles. And then that was really my introduction to the whole prankster scene, that it was a pastiche, it was a collage, it was something that was in continuous evolution, that whatever didn't last could be pasted to the other thing that didn't last and create a new thing. And in that continuous search for a novel way of expressing all these old little bits of things tacked together. And that's the way Ken worked as well. And he would, in his later years, he would work on a thought. And then he'd have a thought, and it would be a really long, rambling, complex, interesting thought. And he would try it out on his friends. And his friends would append their thoughts. And then the next time you heard him expound this thought, it would have your thoughts worked in, and there'd be extra pieces and additions, and it would go in more places, and he'd work it up for weeks until he had a rap. And then he would take his rap on the road. And whatever that rap was at the time that he left to go on the road, that would be his presentation for that particular trip or presentation that he would do. He would use that piece that he'd worked on with everybody, pasting and gluing and running the sentences together. And I just wanted to share with everybody here how his passing has sort of imbued me, and I think a lot of other people, with a sense of responsibility to keep the show going, to be kind to each other, to keep the community, the psychedelic community, in conference with itself and with each other, so that events can happen. Events are what bring people together. And without events, we don't see each other. The internet is lovely and nice, but we need to actually be in each other's presence.